We are pleased that you chose to weather the elements tonight and come and share this cool, rainy evening with us. We're going to learn about the Stephen Lewis Foundation and one of its specific international action programs. My name is Sue Rivers, and as Chair of Church Council, I'm pleased to welcome you tonight. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Barry McIsaac is a native of the Ottawa Valley. Before coming to Cambridge, she lived in Chattanooga, Tennessee, Vancouver, Ottawa, and the Washington, D.C. area. After her husband Don retired from the World Bank, the McIsaacs moved to Cambridge in 2003 because at that time, all three of their children were located within a 90-minute drive from this area. That has since changed, but lucky for us, Barry's chosen to stay. Barry joined the Afri-nanas as their 9th member in 2012, shortly after their formation. She served as secretary, president, and as a member of their Speakers Bureau. There's so much more that could be said about Barry's community involvement and support, but suffice it to say, she is one busy lady. We're excited tonight to learn about one of the organizations that she's passionate about, Grandmothers to Grandmothers. Welcome, Barry.
Thank you very much, and I would like to say thank you to St. Paul's for giving us this chance, because we're always happy to have an opportunity to acquaint people with the work of the grandmothers. So I'm delighted to be here and be able to talk to you about it. I'm going to talk to you about the work of the Stephen Lewis Foundation, and then the work of the grandmothers, and then the work of the Afri-nanas. So that's the way the evening is going to go. So right now we're going to start with a message from Stephen Lewis himself.
We first created the Stephen Lewis Foundation back in 2003. I was absolutely aghast. I was clobbered by the carnage of the pandemic that I was witnessing in Africa and desperate to do something about it in a concrete way. And thus the foundation was formed by way of response. We always worked on the principle that we didn't want to deal with treatment of people living with AIDS because that requires billions of dollars in response. We wanted to deal with the community-based activities where people who needed food and clothing and shelter and health care could be responded to because they were always neglected during the course of the pandemic. And interestingly enough, the foundation has done exactly that, and we've now grown to a position where we have 150 or more projects in some 15 countries, and all of our work is at the grassroots, and particularly with grandmothers and orphan children, orphan grandchildren who have paid the casualty of the AIDS pandemic. It's been an extraordinary experience, and it remains absolutely central to fighting the scourge of HIV and AIDS. And if you want to know more, go to the website stephenlewisfoundation.org.
You may be aware that there are organizations that rate charities. They rate them on their transparency and their efficiency with the funds and so on and so on. And Stephen Lewis Foundation always gets an A in that category. And most of those organizations presume that about 10% of the revenue of the charity will be used for administration. But right at the very beginning, Stephen Lewis promised that every cent the grandmothers raise will go to the African grandmothers. We never have paid any of our money to keep the Stephen Lewis Foundation going. So this slide is old statistics, but I left it in because I want you to see the blue part of the circle is the AIDS, HIV infection in Sub-Saharan Africa. The other colors are all the rest of the world. So you can see the magnitude of the problem. That's what the Stephen Lewis Foundation and everybody was dealing with. And the next slide is very similar. It's showing you the statistics about Sub-Saharan Africa and the rest of the world. And so more than half of the HIV infections globally are in Africa. And I mentioned to some who were here on Sunday, the way this all got started was after Stephen Lewis went to Africa as the ambassador from the United Nations, he realized what had happened, and what this was now, you understand, before the antiretroviral drugs were invented. There was no cure. HIV/AIDS was a death sentence. So what happened was the whole middle generation was wiped out. The best way you can understand it is if all your children died, and maybe your husband died, and you were left to raise the grandchildren. That's the position the African grandmothers found themselves in. And they were, unfortunately, just because of the structure of a lot of the societies, they were all isolated, and they were just trying to cope on a day-to-day basis. And they didn't even have a chance to grieve their own losses because they were so busy trying to feed these children. And sometimes, actually, there's one lady in one of the videos you'll see, she was taking care of 25 children because her own grandchildren were with her, but there were children in the neighborhood who had nobody. So she was feeding 25 children every day. So they themselves were alone and in grief, but also there was no support. There were no pensions, there was no government support for them, there was no anything to help them do the work that they were trying to do. And sometimes they were victims of violence, and think of it, they had 3 strikes against them. They were women, they were old, and they were alone. So they really were in a kind of a desperate situation. And there's one other feature that in many of the cultures, there's a custom called being inherited. And it means that if your husband dies and you were on family property and you have a small farm and you were getting along fine, his relatives could come back and claim the land back into their family, and too bad about you. And so one of the features that has come out of this movement of the grandmothers is that the land title laws are being tightened up very, very much in a lot of places. So the next slide is only our logo. You can see it on our uniforms here, but that's the logo of the Grandmothers Campaign. And the way it got started was when he saw the situation in Africa and he knew he had to do something about it, or wanted to do something about it. His own daughter had had her first child, and she saw the interaction between her mother and that child. And she said, that's the answer. We have to get the Canadian grandmothers involved to help the African grandmothers. So that was the basis of it. And in 2006, on International Women's Day, Stephen Lewis launched the foundation and the Grandmothers Campaign. And that August, they had a gathering of 100 African grandmothers and 200 Canadian grandmothers. And they met in Toronto, and they facilitated their own conference, and they did their own organization and everything. And they came up with what's called the Toronto Statement, which is the guiding bylaw, or whatever you want to call it, the guiding document. And this is the Canadian grandmother's vow that came out of the Toronto Statement. But the next video is the grandmothers telling you their story in their own words. I'd like you to just think about it. I heard, the first time I heard it, I heard a speaker one of the things the Stephen Lewis Foundation does is they take Canadian grandmothers to Africa. Canadian grandmothers pay their own expenses, and they go to Africa and they go to grandmother gatherings. So the African grandmothers know Canadian grandmothers, and the Canadians know African grandmothers. And one of the members from Guelph had been to one of these African trips, and she had come to speak to us. And while she was speaking, I was thinking, and just you should think about it too while you're seeing this video. When our first 2 grandchildren were little, they used to come and stay for a week in the summer. And by the end of that week, we were absolutely wiped. And then I know you're going to relate to that. And then it occurred to me, I'm operating with indoor plumbing, with a washer and dryer, an electric stove, a refrigerator, and air conditioning. And after a week, I was ready to fall on the floor. These people have none of that and go on year in and year out taking care of these children. So, Kurt, if you want to run that video.
Grandmothers have held communities together at a time when nobody knew what to do about the number of deaths, the number of people who were sick, the economic and the social impacts on communities. Grandmothers stepped into the breach because no one else was doing anything. No one else was taking the initiative.
When HIV/AIDS came, it came with a new responsibility upon the grannies, because when the parents are dying, they are leaving the children to the grannies. So it is as if the grannies, after being parents, they start all over again being parents and parents and parents again.
I lost my daughter of HIV and AIDS, leaving me with 3 children. That time it was very hard for me. I was just weak, hopeless, and only deciding, why am I living? Why must I not die? I must also die. So by talking to other grannies, I get a spirit of, why me thinking of dying? And they say, we must come together.
Beba baningi bantwana bayebeda ekuseni nasemini. Le HIV bacedzile badali babo sebasele bahleli bodwana. Nginakekele bantwana bami labasithupha.
Kyenandiyendera irala ensi yona yona etegeere era bwe tunifa twetiisa obuvunaanyizibwa abantu abandi bwe batali kwetiika kale nga twenda tubalage nti tulina kye tuliikola ti nsonga tuli bakaire bategeere nti tulina omulimu gwe tuliikola.
I couldn't bear it, to just sit by and do nothing. And also at the same time, I felt like it wasn't enough just to write a check, that somehow or other we had to connect. And well, how that connection has worked out has been amazing.
Knowledge. We need a skill which can take us somewhere. Not
As grandmothers from Africa and Canada, we were drawn together by our similarities, our deep love and undying devotion to our children and grandchildren, our profound concern about the havoc that HIV/AIDS has inflicted on the continent of Africa.
We, the grandmothers of Africa, speak to you now as the guardians of the future. Our labor with... Our Our labor with all of its struggles, challenges, knowledge, and triumphs has gone unhidden for too long.
Community-based organizations are not only responding to the needs of the grandmothers, they are also empowering the grandmothers to speak for themselves.
They have embraced this challenge because if they do not, it dehumanizes them. It dehumanizes their children. It dehumanizes you and me.
If all of us came together and supported each other and we had the means to do this, we would achieve that dream that seems so impossible of raising an HIV-free generation.
Oh, anybody who knows me knows I'm not big on math, but I'm just going to give you a few statistics. These are the most recent statistics from 2023. Those are the ones we have now. So there are, right now, 39.9 million people worldwide living with HIV. And the really staggering statistic on that slide is that 5.5 million of them don't know they're infected. So that's one of the problems. The antiretroviral drugs, which came in the early 2000s, were absolutely miraculous. At the beginning, they didn't realize it, but they know now that somebody taking treatment with those drugs reduces their viral load to undetectable. And they also know now that if you're undetectable, you can't transmit it, which means even if you have a pregnant mother who's HIV positive and she's taking the treatment, the baby can be born HIV-free. Those drugs are that powerful. And part of the problem, Kurt, you can go to the not so good ones now. Yeah, these are the not so good statistics. The burden is still being borne by women and girls, as you can see, and 3/4 of them live in Sub-Saharan Africa. And they're getting younger and younger. Part of the problem is still that there's a huge stigma attached to being HIV positive. One of the other problems is that in a population where a lot of the people are relatively underexposed to scientific knowledge, they don't really understand how important it is to take the medication. So the adherence to the program, unless they have people watching them and they go to clinics and they get their next supply and they get people making sure that they're taking their medicine and so on, it's a little bit difficult. And so when you have young girls who are poor, who may be forced into the sex trade, and they have no support and they don't really understand how important the medication is, it's not surprising that the rates of new infections in 14 to 19 is fairly high. But given some of the recent developments, the next slide will come as a great shock to you. That's what it costs, 40 cents a day. You can keep somebody alive with 40 cents a day. And so now the question becomes, how does the Stephen Lewis Foundation help? One of the things he decided right from the very beginning, he did mention it in his little speech at the beginning, is that they decided they would always work with grassroots organizations. They only work with organizations that are trusted in the communities and that already have an established program, and they already are, well, let's say they have street cred. You know, people believe them, they trust them. And so then Stephen Lewis's people, he employs a lot of African people, who, mostly women, who go to visit all these projects that ask, you know, they submit maybe a request for a grant or a request for help. And the Stephen Lewis representatives go and visit them. They see how the program works on the ground. They see how their project might be able to be coordinated with that project. And then they report back to Toronto. And then there's a committee that decides how they distribute the money that they have. But they're in 15 countries right now. And one of the things they do is to fund gatherings, like you saw there, the gatherings of those grandmothers. And they also bring the Canadian grandmothers to Canada. One of the things we do is people donate aeroplan points, and they use the aeroplan points to bring the Canadian grandmothers to Canada, and then the Canadian grandmothers organize gatherings, and the African grandmothers come to the gatherings with their supporters, with their interpreter, and they tell their own stories. And I just have to tell you, this is absolutely my favorite story that I don't know, Anne, if you were there at the gathering in Brantford, but this grandmother came, and she had an interpreter, and they introduced her, and she said she'd tell her story. And she lived in a village, and there were so many deaths in her area and in the country that they ran out of coffins, and you couldn't get a coffin. So when people in the village were dying, they were doing the best they could. If they had an old sheet or an old towel or something, they'd try to wrap them up. And this lady thought it was just disgraceful that they didn't have any coffins. So she and two of her friends went to the village council, and they said, we want to go and take a carpentry course so that we can build coffins and our people will be buried with dignity. And they were turned down because in that country, qualified carpenters who were certified as carpenters wore white overalls. And it was against the law for women to wear pants. So they were turned down. So they sat and thought about it for a while, and then they went back to the council and they said, we want to go and take cooking lessons because we want to start a business, and so we want to go and take cooking lessons. So the council thought that was a worthwhile thing to do, and they let them go. And the minute they got out loose, they all went and registered at the carpentry school. And so then they all passed. And so they came back, and they had all the, you know how it was like when your kids were in shop, they had all the stuff they made, and they brought it all back, and they got it all set up. And then they sent a note to the council and invited them to come and see what they had cooked up. And then when the council appeared, they were absolutely blown away to think that women had made all this stuff. And in the end, it turned out there was a new school being built in the village, and they got the contract to build all the desks. So then they were a going concern, and they're still a going concern, and they build coffins. So that was her story, but I've never forgotten her because she was a tough old bird. I mean, she was really a sharp cookie. Anyway, that was that. So then you saw some of those protest marches with the signs. Go-go is the name in, I think it's in Swahili, but some variation of go-go is the word for grandmother. I mean, it's like we would say granny. It's the equivalent. And so grandmother groups can pick their own names. Our founder decided that we'd be Afri-nanas. But there, for example, the Hamilton group is the Grandmothers of Steel. The Brantford group is the Grand River Grannies. The group in Guelph is the Guelph Go-Go Grandmothers. The best one that I ever heard was one of the founding groups way back in 2006, the West Van Go-Go's. I thought that was a real good one. Anyway, any group can start, any group can set themselves up, and right at any given time, there are about 240 groups in Canada working. Some of them, you can imagine, in our demographic, some of them fade away. One group recently around here just announced their retirement. They had all got to be past the point where they could keep going, so they just disbanded. But where one would end, another one starts. So there are about 240 of them going. So then we come to the Afri-nanas, and I might make the point again, you don't have to be a grandmother. You can be a grand-other. And as a matter of fact, among our founders, one lady who designed our logo was a grand-other. She has no grandchildren, but she believes in the work, and she started. So our mission is to raise the money to help the African grandmothers. There is our mission statement right there. The Afri-nanas began in 2011. Valerie Gibault, some of you may know Valerie Gibault, she was the driving force. She had joined the Kitchener group for a year, saw how the game was played, and then said we need one in Cambridge. And so there were 8, of whom at least 3 are still members. Some of the originals have passed away and some of them have retired, but 3 of the original 8 are still with us. Right now we have 21. The most we've ever had is 32, but since the beginning, we've raised over $250,000. Now, Anne will tell you that every year the treasurer can write to the foundation in August, and they will tell you how much your group has contributed for that year, and they keep the cumulative total. And several years ago, we learned that we had raised $254,000, so it's more than that now. We meet on the first Wednesday of the month. Actually, in September, it's usually the second Wednesday because you don't want to get wound up with Labor Day. We meet in Quarry House, which is the community house or community room of Riverwalk. And a number of the members live in Riverwalk, and their board very kindly has said, this is a charitable organization, you can use our party room, so that's where we have the meetings. We don't meet in the summer. And we do awareness raising things like this, and we have a few regular fundraising efforts. In the olden days, we had, well, pre-COVID, we used to have a great big bake sale at Christmas. It was called Nana's Kitchen. And sometimes, well, one year my grandson was getting volunteer hours, and he came to help. I think he was in grade 9. And his father came to pick him up, and he said, how'd you get along? And Alexander said, Papa, they made $2,000. I never even saw $2,000 before. And that was only the baking. That wasn't the rest of it. We have had rummage sales. Last two weeks ago, we had a trunk sale because a friend of a member had a friend who passed away. Her children took what they wanted and said, give all the rest to the Afri-nanas and let them sell it. And we made, what, $2,400 and something at that trunk sale, just on one Saturday morning. The card party was the first thing they ever tried, and the card party still goes on. And there are actually people who come to play cards, play bridge at the card party, who have perfect attendance, except when it was off in COVID. They've been at every single one since 2012, the first time. One of the very easy ones, and it's easy for anybody to help, in the restaurant business, Monday night is traditionally slow. So the Boston Pizza has a feature where they will allow a charity to come in, and you invite your friends to come and eat or to get takeout, and they will give us 10% of everything that's spent in the dining room or on takeout between 5 and 8 on a Monday night. And they also seemingly have a license, and we can run a 50-50 draw. And last November, when we had the last one, it happened that one of my neighbors was the winner, and she took home $282, so she did all right for that night. You can donate Aeroplan miles. In the spring, we have a plant sale, and one of our big fundraisers is we have a walk. We actually just go out and walk ourselves, but people fund our walk, sponsor our walk. And we generally make over $5,000 at least from the walk. But what you can do, you can come to our events, you can donate airline miles, the Aeroplan miles, and you can donate directly to the foundation if you want to. Sometimes people say, if somebody passes away, that the donations would be going to Stephen Lewis. So that's the story. That's the way it goes. There's one more little video that I thought you might be interested in, and it's the voice of one younger client, and she'll tell you her story.
My name is Abeja Winnie. I study in Madvan Primary School. I am ever happy at school.
All these are useful too. Abeja what?
Vegetation.
Vegetation. Very good. Can you clap for her?
In future, I would like to be a bank manager.
I came to know Abeja Winfred in 2010 when she was brought to Omwana House in a very malnourished state. She was not taking her treatment.
I was very sick. I simply heard that I was about to die.
Most of them are malnourished when they come to us, and we just use local food. We don't use anything that is exotic, local food, the food that is really available everywhere in the country. And also sometimes some of them can need supplements.
When I was sick, I did not have energy, but those people in Omwana treated me until I became good.
HIV infection is not just treatment with medication, but you also have to affect the psychosocial well-being of the family. So they have better outcomes, they grow up, live longer, and are healthier.
The major thing is, of course, love. Some kids, they come in when they are full of sores. People fear touching them, but when they are in, you see, some of us, we hug them. It just opens the brain of that kid that there's somebody who loves me.
Play is an important aspect in the lives of children. We involve them in painting, shading, and drawing of pictures.
Toy library is taking toys to the communities now. Cortlands run this program in disadvantaged areas. So the toy librarian will give the toys according to the child's age, according to the child's need.
Each case has to be handled differently. There are children that will not tell you what is wrong with them, but when you use the play aspect or the play therapy, you try to find out some of those issues by just observing them.
Once someone has the knowledge, then they have the power to change their situation. For the small ones, as well as the grown ones, the grown-up children, we have to involve the guardians.
We do health education with the parents one-on-one. We also do awarenesses But beside those awarenesses and health education, we also have got a parenting program where we invite each and every member of the family or of the community to come to that parenthood program.
Even if I am sick, I can still become a bank manager. I can still play with my friends. I can still learn. I can still enjoy my life.